You need to put your mic on.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you for being here. My name is Mayan Trebuchet and I work at Gutman Library. I wanted to just welcome everyone to our final book talk of 2023. I would like to introduce the two authors who wrote Education Leadership, Advancing Women in K-12 Administration. We have Jennie Weiner, who is Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Connecticut. And we have Monica Higgins, the Kathleen McCarthy Professor of Education Leadership here at HGSC. Welcome.
Welcome, everybody. Whoops, nope. There we go. Welcome, everybody. You hear us okay? So delighted to have you here and to give us an opportunity to introduce this book. Jennie is first author on. Jennie and I go way, way back, and it's been super fun to work on this project together. And I'd love to have Jennie start off saying how she came to the work, and then we'll get into it. And we'll be kind of watching our time wherever the clock is. Where's the clock?
On our wrist, I think.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I think it got mentioned, but I am an alumni, so you can actually graduate and leave here. So that's really wonderful news, probably for everyone in this room to some extent. The reason that we decided to write this book is I have had the privilege and pleasure to work with women leaders at various stages in their career in K-12 for a long time. And as I went around and did that, I often heard the same kind of stories. And those stories often were about feeling less than, diminished, not powerful, put down. And also, oftentimes they were about what I would call sort of gendered criticisms. Too much, too little, too loud, too soft, too emotional, right? Too intense. One would think being intense in a field where we desperately need people, right, with passion would be a good thing. Oftentimes it was not framed that way. And because so many women felt this way, and I was seeing a pattern, but they weren't, right? And why? Because there was a lot of shame. There was a sense of shame and that the problem was them. And when they went to others for advice, that advice actually tended to situate the problem in them. Why don't you lean in? Be more aggressive, be less aggressive. Talk to fewer people, have more mentors, have fewer mentors.
Don't
Go
use
over
your
there.
hands.
Don't use your hands where you talk. Don't look so feminine, look more masculine. You're coming across kind of harsh.
You look angry.
You look angry. Watch your face. I get that one. So the problem with all of that, of course, is it situates discrimination in individuals and it points us in the wrong direction, right? It points us towards individual having to solve systematic problems. But if you don't have language and you don't have a way of talking and we're not honest about these stories and we don't tell our stories, then we feel like the problem is us. Right? So the purpose of this book is to try to move away. First, to name systemic discrimination, gendered racism, and how it manifests so that we are diagnosing the problem correctly. And two, by reorienting ourselves away from twisting ourselves in knots or telling others to do that, towards thinking about how we can come together, right, as allies and sisterhood to try to fix those systemic issues so that all of us can thrive with our full selves in these spaces. So that's really what pushed us. And I've had Monica come and speak to women's groups, which I think she'll speak to also.
Yeah, so I came to the work via Jennie. So Jennie had me come down and give a talk to some superintendents in Connecticut. And I remember I gave this talk, and some of you know this work on developmental networks, and I might even bring some of that into our conversation today. And at the very end, we were sitting around and the superintendents, the women were talking, and they were mentioning various different things about, all the stuff, not having their voice really truly at the table. These are superintendents. These are extraordinarily talented, strong women. And they're sitting around talking about this. I'm like, oh my goodness, we know something about this. And yet, when Jennie and I would teach in women in leadership programs, oftentimes we found that people didn't have the theory, they didn't have the research, they didn't even have the space to really talk about or name what's going on, other than things like lean in more and adjust yourself. So anyway, and so then Jennie came here, she taught a course on women in leadership, visiting as a visiting scholar. And she really started working on this. And I joined her in the journey. So it's been terrific.
Yes, it has been terrific. And it's so exciting that it's here and that we can talk about it. One of the things in terms of today and the structure of the book, so if you're interested in buying it, but just so you have a sense of it, is that what we do is we introduce these larger frameworks. Then we provide real life stories of, for example, some of the women from the class, the women we've been working on, research I've done, and we tell their story. We're going to do that today together. And then we have an opportunity to kind of put those ideas together, debrief, understand, and diagnose, and think about steps forward. So today we're going to focus on that, and we're going to really focus on one of what might be the more opening salvo, which is thinking about how care work is expected of women and also exploited.
So we're just taking one topic. So again, the idea is there is theory about this, there is research about this. We're just picking one topic for today.
So on that note, we're going to get you started. You see, this is a tweet from Secretary Miguel Cardona, who actually got quite a bit of pushback for this tweet when it originally came out. This is a few years ago, post-COVID, I believe. And it says, teachers are nothing short of heroes. So what we'd like you to ask you to chat with your colleagues at your table is, what does hero mean in this context? Right? What are some of the things that educator heroes are expected to do, given that definition? And would that be normal in other jobs? Okay. And then last question, since so many of you gave knowing sort of amens to the exploitation of care, we're wondering, is there any way that this expectation could be related to the fact that 80% of educators are women? Enjoy. Talk amongst yourselves. All right, so, wow, that was good. All right, so what were you all talking about? And I noticed that there's a mic at each table. So what were you all talking about? You're being voluntold, I see. And just tell us your name as well.
Hi, I'm Claire. We were talking a little bit it's like something that was brought up in the book about how ambitious women often that want a leadership role end up the only place that they can get one is kind of in a system that's already rather broken or needs fixing.
I see.
And how when women then fail or to make organizational change or whatever, or to, you know, have this incredible one woman turnaround, how we put that in women compared to men, where
Yes.
often we're like, oh, well, they didn't have the resources. And I always talk about how in the UK, we've just had two, like, people would see them as failed female prime ministers. And it was so the same thing. Like, it was a poison chalice. No one else wanted the job.
Right.
A woman's like went in to fill that role. And then everyone was like, oh, well, that's what you get when you have a female leader. And like, how, if it's happening on this huge, like, international scale, imagine like what's happening every day. And also I think it was in the book where I talked about like that also disproportionately affects women of color and women that are not so like traditionally represented in leadership.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. Okay, so women coming in to save, I mean, we have a whole chapter on this glass cliff phenomenon. So women oftentimes asked to come in and to take over in really just unusually difficult circumstances. And then when it doesn't work out, the attribution is to the woman, not to the circumstances. Okay. Other folks, what were you talking about? What were you talking about? Heroes? What were you talking? Yeah, thanks, please.
Hi.
Amy,
We'll
and
get
then
it.
Evan.
We'll get it. We'll get it. We'll get it. We're watching. We're watching.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Amy.
Hi, Amy.
So we were talking about the term hero, where it's not just limited to education where we see the word hero, but whenever there is a field where it requires a lot of sacrifice, then we see the term hero, like war heroes, military veterans, the police, the paramedics. Those terms, hero is usually associated with sacrificing something in their life. So for example, the family members are going to suffer. They're not going to have a good work-life balance. So putting teacher and hero together, that's demanding us of that.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
That's really interesting too, because many of the jobs that you're talking about, at least I might also think about them as like a core, CORPS, right? So there is this sort of selflessness, both in terms of I'm supposed to give fully of myself, like myself is less than the work, but also this sort of idea that we're interchangeable, right? Like that myself is actually invisible to some extent, right? And the work comes first, right? The work is more than the self. Interesting. All right, she's pushing you. Let's hear it.
Thank you,
Oh,
Ebony.
stop.
Still your
Sure,
words. We talked about hero as well, but also looking at it as a term that means almost certain death, because you can't be a hero unless you have a villain. And what she said really leans into that. And I thought about the shield when you said you're almost not a person. You're not, because what you do is for this shield that you carry. And when you think about movies, heroes come, they go, they die, and someone else rises up to continue on. Like, I don't know why I thought about Black Panther, and the second Black Panther died, and a female, they lost the mom, they almost lost the entire kingdom almost immediately.
Yeah.
And the idea, not saying because she was a woman, but that so often happens, is like this expectation of some sort of death that you're gonna have, whether that be your family, yourself,
Right.
your values, or something, in
Wow.
order for you to take on the role.
Yeah. Yeah.
That relates right to the sacrifice point. Do you want to, Ebony, do you want to add? All right.
I would also say, just to that point too, which I think is really powerful, is to add the idea of what is the reward, right? The reward is knowing that you are leaving a legacy, but you may not be there, which is of course a wonderful thing. I'm not diminishing that, but I'm wondering if we can make some kind of connection to being a hero and not getting paid adequately. Right? I mean, there may in fact be a connection between low pay, having to buy your own supplies. What? Right? Being expected to work long hours that you were not paid for, social status, that is connected to this idea that we are supposed to be selfless, right? So when you hear this kind of language, I think it's worth questioning, not that we are proud or not proud of our profession, of course, but is this manipulative, right? And if it is manipulative, what is it manipulating, right? What is it trying to pull on to get people to always do more with less, right? And can that be related to a feminized structure? And obviously our argument is yes, right? I'm actually going to just skip through that. So just to kind of situate this a little bit, here are some numbers which you may or may not be familiar with. They're, I think, from last year. And I would say, I think the numbers are worse post-COVID. But what you see, of course, is, right, we had huge, very large number of teachers or women. There are more teachers who identify as women in elementary schools than in secondary. That is gender too, right? Natural extension of care. So with the little ones, right, more appropriate. You see the same thing at principals, right? So we go from 78% to 54%, but still, right, most principals who are women are in elementary schools. Only 30% of high schools have people who identify as women as principals. And of course, you have to be usually a principal at a high school to be able to be in superintendent. So it's not a surprise, right, that only 27% of superintendents are women. And that number has not budged in like 15 to 20 years. Okay. And of course, this doesn't attend to race. So when you think about how many principals are people of color in America today, it's about 11% are Black. And Black women represent only 7% of principals totally. Okay. And they represent only 1.5% of superintendents are Black women.
I should say, just saying that we probably should have mentioned this up front.
Sure.
And maybe, you know, from just looking at the blurb and so forth, this is a US-based study, K-12. Some of us have, you know, a lot of expertise in other cultural contexts. So we totally welcome you to bring in those other cultural contexts. That's where I just want to, that is the context here.
Thank you. Yeah. These numbers don't look a heck of a lot better across industries. So,
And the irony is, you know, education is a feminized profession. So I was just talking to some colleagues in business before this presentation. And these numbers would be especially striking to them because there are some assumptions, right, that you can kind of move up. And yet there are barriers to progression, as Jennie was just saying.
yes. And on that point, I just want to be really clear about when we say feminized profession, what we mean and how it relates to the previous conversation, right? So a feminized profession means that more women are clustered within that profession, right? But it also means that we don't respect it because women do it. It is devalued because it is considered to be of women's work. So why is that important? Because it helps to explain many of the things that we were just talking about, but it also helps to explain, right, the lack of professional dignity with which we are treated, right? What other industry would externalize people feel that they know how to do that work better and then be able to dictate the parameters of that work, or make the argument that anybody can be a teacher with a 2-month training course? Right? So clearly there is some belief systems associated and attached with the idea that more women do it and that we do not value it as much because women do it.
That's a thought experiment. You know, would you pull somebody off the street to come in and, you know, serve as your PCP or your lawyer? No. But people who've been to school, so they oftentimes assume, yeah, I can do that. I'll just come in and teach. In fact, I was in a meeting, it was mostly business folks again. Skydeck, I'm just being real here. Skydeck, this gentleman says, well, you know, teaching, I mean, it's not rocket science. Actually, it is.
Or we wouldn't have rocket scientists. Okay. So what are we arguing here? Well, we're arguing that the source of much of this and women's inability, or right, the barriers that Monica was talking about that they face, has to do with sexism. So what do we mean by that? Well, we talk about this idea of ambivalent sexism. It doesn't mean people are confused, right? They're not ambivalent about whether or not they're sexist. Rather, they hold two competing ideas of sexism simultaneously, okay? So one sexist idea is what we might call hostile sexism, which is like, I just don't value women, right? I don't think they're as smart or as capable or so on and so forth. right? That's harder to say out loud, or at least it used to be. We might have an argument about that. Given that we live in America. However, right, like we all sort of recognize that, right? It's seeable. We kind of know something's wrong. What I would call the more sneaky kind of sexism, and the one that's associated with uplifting care, or right, like perverting care, is around the idea of benevolent sexism. So benevolent sexism is the idea that there is a special place for women, right? There's something special about them that is situated in care and being delicate and needing protection, right? And that motherhood and mothering are a natural extension. And so that is what they are deemed or supposed to do in society, right? That would be appropriate for them to be placed there. And we need to protect those parameters to facilitate their access to those things, right? So this might come and say, wow, like I was talking to a special educator recently, and she said one of the things that always happens to her is people are like, you're just such a special kind of person to work with those kids all day. Wow. I would say, I mean, it's incredibly patronizing, but also sexist, right? That there is something about her, right? And women being more capable of working in those kinds of settings, as opposed to being highly professionalized, right? Really knowing what she's doing and being able to serve a marginalized community that needs, right, that kind of support and expertise. Okay. So extending that, Monica, you'll jump in.
Yeah.
Are these ideas of how care manifests. So there's this idea, this is old research, Hochschild from like the 60s, unfortunately still quite prescient. These are numbers from today. So the idea that women go to work, they do their full shift, and then they come home and they have a second shift, okay? And that second shift is usually around the devalued work of care, right? Kids, elderly parents, siblings, right? All that kind of jazz. So today, right, women are working outside the home at the highest level of any time in history, highest number of women as primary breadwinners. They have the least amount of free time they've ever had in the history. They do more home-based labor today than in the 1970s. Right? And this is true for women who are not partnered, right? So I just want to be clear, right? You don't have to have a partner to be expected through familial networks and other things to be the caregiver in the family. So we can imagine, right, like how pooped you are and whether or not you have the bandwidth or the time to be able to take on external leadership opportunities, but also what would happen if you said, no, I'm not going to do that care work.
You might get hung up on. Actually.
Right. I mean, so it's, it's worth thinking about, and being single or being single mother or what have you does not necessarily mean that you don't have to do this work.
Can I add
Please do.
I was just gonna add, because I know some people are in higher ed. That oftentimes, I mean, this research was done in higher ed. I'm sure it happens in K-12, but I'm less familiar. But in higher ed, that women are often asked to sit on various committees because we need diversity in the committees. So the issue with this is obvious, and women of color in particular, right? You're sitting on so many committees that guess what? You have no time to do your real work or the work that you're being judged on for promotion. And then if you couple that with what Jennie just said about what's going on in your off hours, you don't have time. So there's a scarcity fairness issue.
Yes, and that's actually the second point. Thanks for teeing that up, Monica, which is this idea of emotional labor. So everybody, if you think about a place you'd like to work, right, in your life, or a place you'd like to be, you would imagine that people are caring towards each other. They say hello, they have conversation. Maybe if it's someone's birthday, they care, right? People try to deal with interpersonal in an appropriate manner. So we all know that care matters, right? Showing up on committees, being a full present member, doing all that work to make it a decent place to be and work and live. But I want you to think about whether or not those things were built into the performance structures of your organization.
Nope.
Where it was in the merit, promotion, the job. Could you write it down? Really nice, remembered everybody's birthdays on my resume. So we all know it matters.
Just a little extra time.
Right? No, I'm being serious. And if you're a jerk, does anybody care? I mean, we may care in the abstract, but can you get promoted if you're a jerk? And I would say in my industry, you can. That's why I'm here. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. We can ask my colleagues. But here's the point, right? Women and people of color are disproportionately, to Monica's point, asked, tasked, expected to fulfill these care roles. I had a superintendent, I was telling Monica, I had a superintendent who had like a Costco rack in her garage because she brought snacks to board meetings. She is the head of the school system. And if she doesn't bring the snacks, no one eats. What? I love snacks. I'm pro snacks. I'm asking some questions about why she feels that is her job and why do others assume it is her job, right? And why it is invisible. Invisible. All right. And then finally is this idea of invisible labor, which is a final kind of care. And invisible labor is the idea that I have a bunch of emotions about things that are happening to me. Perhaps I have strong emotions about feeling less than or being put upon, but I have to regulate those emotions and present a face that is more amenable or acceptable to the group so that I can persist, right? So my care is to care for you and your feelings and push all my feelings down, right? And again, the question is not, does everybody do this to some extent? Of course we do, right? Like there's lots of things that happen in our life. We go to work, we can't be like screaming at everybody. The question is, right, is who is allowed? What is the barriers of permissible behavior for certain people based on their identity? What does it mean, right, for me to, right, say, I don't like how you're talking to me versus somebody else?
Has anybody in the room been shushed on the side in a meeting, like texted on the side, like, be careful? Yeah, the mentoring, okay. Yeah, I said we lost it. We lost it, okay.
You want to talk about it?
Yeah, let's see. One of the things that we were gonna mention is that the extent to which you feel as though you have support also takes more time and energy. So women tend to have these functionally differentiated networks. So if you think about, I don't know whether you can see this. Certainly people, oh, Zoom land people. I don't know if we have any on this Zoom. Welcome, welcome. But you're not going to see this. Sorry. So the thing is that women, men. So if you think about a developmental network, these are people who you go to for support. You might think of them as kind of your personal board of directors. Women can, men can go to people here within their place of work, like their employer. Maybe they can go to a professional association, right? And they have like 4 people in their network. And it's pretty straightforward because oftentimes they can identify with these people who are also in their place of work because they've kind of come up the same ranks and so forth. And they can get all their career and psychosocial support within the place of work, whereas women tend to have functionally differentiated networks. What does that mean? That means that in order to get your psychosocial support, you might go to somebody in your family, you might go to somebody from a prior school, you know, affiliation that you have, graduate school, whatever, and maybe you'd have one, of course, in a professional association, right? And one in your employer. And the point of this, because this is also 4 people, is you've got 4 people. This is a wide-ranging network. This one, this is a low-range network. This is a very efficient network, one-stop shopping, right? To maintain this network, and it's the same kinds of support, both psychosocial and career support, takes a lot more work. So just thinking about that, you combine it with what's going on at home, what you're asked to do at work, and then if you're helping yourself in terms of this network piece, you're definitely in a double bind, and it definitely takes more resources and time and energy.
Yes. All right. So we just did like a fire hose version of what care work looks like in context.
Yeah.
So now what we're going to do is invite you to see about applying some of those understandings within the context of a real life story. So this is a story of Francesca.
Disguised.
It's disguised. This is a real person that we think hopefully will resonate with many of you. This is a live link. If you could, it has the case. And we're going to give you about 10 or so minutes to read the case. And then we're going to ask you to discuss these 2 questions, which is how does Francesca's history of supporting her peers in care work right, both help and hinder her ability to access leadership. Because like, what does this all have to do with leadership, right? That's kind of the point. And then her boss, this is her principal, Miss Heyman, we're going to ask you to noodle on, right? How did Miss Heyman act? Did you like it, right? What could she have done maybe to support Francesca more? Feel free to, if you finish reading, chat with your colleagues, and then we'll debrief the case together. Is everybody good? Thumbs up? Fantastic. All right, go for it. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah. It's different when you talk. Yeah.
True. That's the next.
You want to grab them in like 3 minutes?
Yep. Yeah, because they just see some of them. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right, you guys ready to come back? I like the fact that you're kind of in the middle, that you're digging into it a little bit. So let's talk about Francesca. Let's talk about Francesca a little bit. So what did you notice about her history of supporting her peers and how this may have helped her, but also hurt her at the same time? What were you chatting about? What did you notice? What were you talking about? Don't be shy. Yeah, please, go ahead.
My name is Jody. So our group were talking about like since Francesca is already supporting her peers and all the work beyond her job description responsibilities. So there's less. So from the management point of view, like the formality of her leadership role, like, is it necessary to move forward to that step?
Yeah, yeah. Is it necessary? She clearly didn't think it was worth it, but she was expected to do it. Yes. Does anybody resonate with this? Has this ever happened to anybody in the room? I would think pretty much everybody in the room, right? Okay. So how does this relate also back to this hero idea we started off with in the morning, in the beginning of this session? Other folks? Do you think she's being a hero? Or is she just doing her job? Who's what? Go ahead, Cody.
Think more than a hero, she's being a martyr. I think what the way in which she hurt herself was that she met a need, and therefore the system didn't feel the pressure to actually respond and solve that problem. So she stepped in and met that need. Had maybe she created space, then the system would have responded, felt the need to reorganize and find money, but it said she stepped in,
Right.
which I think ultimately hurt her aim. I think the help, I mean, in some ways, like she had garnered it sounded like a lot of informal authority. So she probably that maybe could have been leveraged to her advantage in some way. And I think also had she been given eventually a formal leadership position, she had maybe was positioned in a way to be received. But ultimately, I think she hurt the cause because the system had just learned to rely on her to meet that need. So it didn't have to respond because she was responding.
She
for
was
it.
responding. How do you think she felt about this leadership role? What's the sense you got? How do you think she felt about the leadership role? How do you think she felt about that? What do you think? All right, Ebony.
I don't know if this directly answers your question, but it's almost as if she believes that if she goes into leadership, those responsibilities will go away, but it's more about her behaviors that she's doing versus the actual task. So that's what I was thinking. So it doesn't answer your question, but that was my case.
Yeah.
I have another question for you.
Is it a role or a title?
Interesting.
Yeah, and would she be able to relinquish the other pieces?
I think
Right.
this, to Monica's question, I think to your point earlier, I wonder, does Francesca feel like she can say no? Because it sounds like, right, from your point, she could leverage, she could figure out, so how do we know she doesn't feel like she can say no, or why does she feel like she can't? Say
You're talking
no?
about saying no to the
To
request.
other job, right, like she has some interactions where she's like, I don't know if I can take those students, right? And Ms. Heyman says, well, you're so wonderful with them. And you would really be great with them, but we can maybe find someone else if you can't handle it. Yes, sir.
Derek.
Oh, Derek, I'm sorry. I don't know.
It's almost that idea that you have to go above and beyond to get promoted. And so you take on more responsibilities with the intention of moving up. And so I think when she actually asked, can I move up to a different position, and was told, no, there's no money there, she starts to really think about, okay, why am I doing all of these things if there is no room for me to move up in this position?
And besides, people are going to still ask her, right? People are still going to ask. Now, Susan Moore Johnson happens to be in the room and knows a little bit about this, promoting teachers to leadership positions above the peers. What did you think about this case? This is a straight call.
I had to
call,
find
but
out how to do this.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's a great book, you folks. I've read it. So my response to this is kind of echoing whoever said over here, is it a role or
Yeah.
a title?
Yeah.
And as I look at these kinds of situations across schools, unless there's a formal structure for it, some sort of system
Yeah.
where teacher leader means something, where there's compensation in time
Yes.
off or money,
Right.
and where the responsibilities are defined, it's not going to change. And especially in a situation where people are kind of manipulated to believe that they have to keep doing more and more good in that.
She's
So-
bought it.
Yeah.
I just think neither of these people is going to be responsible for actually changing things. And so we were talking here about So who is it? Do you have to imagine that the higher ups are going to recognize this? And leverage is interesting, and it's certainly a possibility, but Francesca is not likely to exercise it.
Right. No,
She
she's
can't
not.
leave. She has her kids in school. She can't,
Exactly.
all of those things.
Yeah, all those things.
Yeah.
One thing you said, Susan, which is really powerful, and I think back to the earlier argument is, and I think someone else here said, it's like taken for granted that she'll just do this, which another word for that is it's invisible and normalized. And I think what Susan's adding is like, in order for it not to be taken for granted, it has to be visible and structurally part of the system, right?
Exactly.
So, but I also just want to keep on this idea that, you know, who feels like they can say no? And what do we believe, or what have we been told that our reward for saying yes will be? Right? Because again, this is not to diminish Francesca being a wonderful person. I happen to know the person who, right, is Francesca. She is a wonderful person who would do anything for her school. But I think she truly believed that this would create, to your point, access to leadership, right? The accrual of all this work would get her to the next step, but because it's invisible, it's not getting her anywhere except for at home, right? On the weekend working instead of having a life.
So this ties right back to the beginning of our conversation, right? The structural constraints and not actually putting this into the performance management, not actually putting it into the system at all.
Ms. Heyman.
Yeah, yeah, right, Ms. Heyman. So
What do people think about Ms. Heyman?
What do you think? Anything Ms. Heyman could have, should have, would have done, or not said, possibly.
I will, as you're noodling this, maybe there's other parallel things that have happened to you. I know that I spoke another story of, and many of the women I've spoken to have gotten finally promotions to be principals, and it takes men, teachers to get administrative position about 5 to 7 years if they want that promotion. White women 7 to 9, Black women 12 to 15 years. So those opportunities don't come along all the time. When they finally do, one of the women that I spoke to, more than a few, said when they finally told their principal that they were leaving, they said, "How could you do this to us?
Yep.
How could you do this? We all depend on you, right?
Yeah.
You should," like insinuating, you should be more grateful to us.
Yeah, performance punishment. Any thoughts on Ms. Heyman? Ruby.
I think she's a product of the same system.
Yeah, good point.
So when these extra supports that Francesca is performing essentially for the school and the school community are baked into implicit expectations over time, she is just doing what she's learned, which is that this is what we expect from our female leaders.
What we need.
And the behavior of like, I don't mean this in such a negative context because I'm not sure she's aware of it, but like manipulative language and like emotional ploy for like, how dare you leave our community stranded like this, is certainly learned over time. And I'm sure she had a leader, perhaps not a woman, who said the same thing to her.
Yeah, so powerful. So one of the things we're hoping to do with this book is to disrupt this mindset. So I think, Susan, you're right. It's very difficult for any one individual to do anything. But if we start becoming aware of this and make some of this discussable, then our hope is that we will be able to create systems and structures that actually reward the work that's actually being done. And that does take some unlearning as well as learning. So, I mean, you have your own takeaways, the way we've organized this. So Francesca, she's expected to engage in extra work without additional comp. It's not just comp, it's just, she's being depleted actually, right? The care work hurts her teaching, social life, her leadership trajectory. Her status as a single woman, I don't know how many of you have experienced this, may actually be a root cause of devaluing of her free time, right? Well, you don't have the dependent care issues. And then when we see a problem, we tend to default. I mean, literally, I just heard this morning, somebody saying, well, you know, I probably should have. No. You just stop putting it on yourself. I mean, yes, of course, there are behaviors, there are tactics, there are strategies. But you all are leaders and are going to be leaders. So you're going to be in positions in which you actually can be architects to bring about the change that you want to see. And of course, the question around, are you Francesca? So what next? Can I say one thing about the organization of the book? So there are these chapters, and kind of like what we did today, we give some research first. This is very on Monica, like I never do this. Give the research first and then the case. Search first, then the case. And since cases are projective, you might say, do I know a Francesca? Am I Francesca, et cetera, and so on, or even a little tiny bit. Then we give you questions to think about, and we diagnose the case, and then we end with, of course, reflective practice questions for you. So that's how we organize. Yeah. So, I mean, I think Monica brought a lot of these up, but, you know, again, if it's invisible, we can't diagnose it. Right. So Francesca's always the problem until she's not, right? Until Susan shows up and says, wait a second, do you have roles and responsibilities associated with teacher leadership, right? Is it a position? Do you have compensation, time, so on and so forth, right? So we have to talk about these things. It might be worth thinking about auditing your current practices in your organization. I would say if they did it my job, it would be, I've been advocating for this around care work. It is yet to be done, but it seems important, right? Like it doesn't just show up in the visible, it shows up in the invisible, and we have to uninvisible it. And again, like reward care. We all know that nobody wants to work in a place where nobody cares for each other or cares for their students or cares for their colleagues or what have you. And we all know that takes time and energy, and it should be part of the ways that we think about our work and each other and who gets elevated and who doesn't, and so on and so forth. So And talk about it.
and talk
Do you
about
want to tell them the place that we were asked to give a talk?
Yes, sure. Sure. So
Well, not specifically.
unsurprisingly, we've been asked to give a lot of talks. I was asked by a women's group to come and talk as a keynote, which was exciting. I was very excited. My husband knows the story. And I began to tell them about what we do and about the book and so on and so forth. And they said, you know, we want women to feel good after your session. So could you talk about something a bit more neutral? And I said, no. So I'm not giving that talk, but
And we don't want it to become political, right?
right, we didn't want it to be political. There's going to be a mix of people. Now, I mean, the irony, of course, it's a woman's talk, but again, you know, these feel perhaps accessible to us, like within our reach, because they are so, at least for me, they're so part of my lived experience. It doesn't feel spicy to name something that I have to live with every goddamn day. However, right, I want you to think about, to Monica's point, I train superintendents, principals, teachers, teacher leaders, EDD students. I ask them, many of you are overeducated, and I say, how many times were you in a leadership class where you read a book that was by a woman about leadership? How many times did you read a book that was from a person of color about leadership? Most say none, right? So, right, this is a
highlight stories
or,
about.
yeah, I mean, right, or had a teacher of that identity, right? So this is a big issue. Like I know it feels prescient and it feels real, but this is an issue we need to be talking about.
And we have ways of talking about it. I think
And
that's the
hopefully
thing.
this will help.
Just kind of, sitting around and talking about it, but the way it's organized, the book is there is research on this. Like what you're feeling is not just you, it's not you. There's stuff that's happening structurally that we can work on.
So on that note, we do have some time for questions. I know there were some people online who might want to, or we welcome any questions at all. And there's a QR code and there's a coupon and there's swag at the table. So, and also just thank you. It's like obviously a place of passion for me. And I can't tell you what it means to be able to share a little bit of this with all of you. Yeah, so just thank
Agreed.
you so much.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And actually, when we give this talk, what happens is kind of what happened today. Like we gave the case and you guys were talking, we're like, well, we'll give them 1 more minute. No, we'll give them 2 more minutes. No, and I'm just going to interrupt them because people want to talk about it.
So any questions, if there's ones online? Yes, please.
Thank you.
Some research suggests that the leadership gap is closing more rapidly for women now in various industries due to generational shifts. For example, women who are entering the workforce now have been educated in a Title IX supported environment and are given more opportunities to develop leadership skills as they grow up. In your research, have you seen this kind of shift in the K through 12 leadership pipelines? Or do you see primary/secondary education as an industry that lags behind these trends?
Lags. Lags behind these trends. I also feel like one of the reasons I think, so I have some friends who are in finance and they've actually done a really good work on this, both in terms of diversifying by race, but also by gender at top levels. And one of the reasons is there's externalized pressure to do so. Meaning there are scorecards that companies come with and they say, or endowments or what have you, and they ask them and they say, you know, what does your company look like? And we will do business with you if it looks this way, which I think is wonderful. I'm wondering who's putting pressure on schools to attend to these issues. When are the adults discussed? Right? Monica and I were talking about this with someone else and I said, you know, we talk so much about creating equitable and just systems for children. How can we have schools that have those characteristics if the people who work in them are not treated justly? Right? I mean, so I think, right, I'm not suggesting that I am totally pro sort of market pressures as a means of changing the world, but I do think more pressure in this arena would be helpful because or a groundswell of us coming together to demand it. But it doesn't feel like our industry has moved as rapidly, perhaps, as others.
Actually, and if you think about it, there are two other pieces of data to suggest, you know, we're talking about a teacher shortage. Okay, it goes back and forth whether we think there's a teacher shortage. Most people say there is, so who's leaving? Actually, women are leaving. And then post-COVID times or during COVID times, guess what? That share of work, so many ways in which women were not able to do their core job. So I would expect, although I don't know what the studies say, that post-COVID times actually have been disrupted quite a bit. And I don't know that that's different across industries. That's a good question.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I think that, thank you. I think the last question on your slide for discussion is one that is worth exploring with people who both aspire to leadership and people who are in leadership roles. What does it mean to be a sponsor? What does it mean to be an advisor?
Great.
What are the structures in place to have a conversation about what one aspires to? Because I think what was interesting in the case, and I couldn't access it, so thank you, Derek. So Derek gave me a succinct summary. What was interesting was, for me, was that there were two people engaged in a conversation, right, about what one aspired to, the title. She's asking questions. Can she have a title change? Can she have more money? And it was like a ding, 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 ding. This is a person that is looking for some guidance. They're looking to be met halfway. I think what she was doing, what Francesca was doing actually wasn't invisible. It was visible to quite a few people who were benefiting, even the person that was in that principal role.
Right.
So that last question, you know, whoever it was that said to you, can you talk about something positive? I think that's the positive. It's the here's what you can do next.
Exactly.
Because I don't think that some of us in leadership positions are as transparent about how we got there, right?
Yeah.
And I think people who are aspiring to positions of leadership, maybe not principal, not everybody wants to be that.
Right.
But, you know, can you show me the path? Can you talk to me about, can you listen to my goals? Can you talk to me about how you got there? Can you create a path for me?
Right.
Like that, for me, would have been, I'm not going to say fair compensation, but it would have been the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? Because then I would have realized that I had somebody in my corner.
Yeah. So back to this developmental network, thinking about those roles of those sponsors, those allies, and those peers. There's also just micro things that you can do. I mean, these are big, what you're talking about are big conversations. There are also small things that you can do, which I did just experience at a meeting this morning. It was really interesting. Because sometimes you're boxed out, you know, somebody else might, maybe your voice isn't heard. there's a lot of really fascinating research. And it just relates a little bit to what you're saying on upward voicing and different tactics you can take to amplify, give an example, justify. There are like explicit tactics that you can take to make sure that people's voices are actually heard in the important meetings, so that people are like, oh yeah, they don't just caretake or do all this extra stuff, extra role behavior. They're doing fantastic work in the meeting, and you can hear them. But it takes some disrupting. So I like that idea of sponsorship in the moment and actually broader too.
I see that it's time. I want to invite, we'll leave our email addresses if those folks would like to engage. Be happy to answer the questions. Thank you for coming for those online. And of course, thank you so much for